Under the vast Montana sky where golden prairie grass swayed in the afternoon breeze and the sun painted everything in shades of amber and gold, there stood a weathered ranch house that had seen 50 years of seasons come and go. Sarah Mitchell was 32 years old and 8 months pregnant when her car broke down on the dusty road that ran past the old Henderson ranch, and as she stood there in the merciless heat with her hand pressed against her swollen belly, she felt something she had been trying to ignore for the past hour becoming impossible to dismiss. The pain was sharp and sudden, and it took her breath away. She had been driving to her sister's place in Billings, where she planned to stay until the baby came, but now, standing beside her steaming car with nothing but empty fields stretching in every direction, she realized that plan was falling apart as quickly as the afternoon was fading into evening. Thomas Henderson was 63 years old, and he had lived alone on this ranch since his wife Margaret passed 5 years ago, and he had grown accustomed to the silence broken only by the sound of cattle lowing in the distance and the wind whistling through the old barn. He was mending a fence post when he saw the figure on the road, and at first he thought it might be a mirage, because it had been so long since anyone had walked this stretch of highway, but as he squinted into the sun, he could see it was a young woman, and she appeared to be in distress. Thomas wiped his weathered hands on his jeans and started walking toward the road with his border collie Scout trotting beside him, and as he got closer, he could see the woman more clearly, and what he saw made him quicken his pace. Sarah was leaning against her car and her face was pale, and when she saw the older man approaching, she tried to straighten up and compose herself, but another wave of pain washed over her and she gasped out loud. "I can't hold it in anymore," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. Thomas had seen plenty of things in his 63 years on this earth, and he had helped deliver calves and foals in the middle of winter storms, and he had learned long ago that sometimes life doesn't wait for convenient moments. "How far along are you?" he asked gently, and his voice carried the calm authority of someone who had weathered many storms. 8 months, she replied, and tears were starting to stream down her face, and I was trying to get to Billings, but the car. And now I think the baby is coming. Thomas looked at the sun sinking lower on the horizon, and he calculated distances and time in his mind, and he knew that the nearest hospital was 40 miles away. And even if they called an ambulance, it would take too long. "Come with me," he said, and he offered her his arm, and his touch was gentle and steady. Sarah hesitated for just a moment because she had been taught to be careful around strangers, but there was something in this man's eyes that reminded her of her own father who had passed when she was just 16, and she saw kindness there and strength, and she knew somehow that she could trust him. They walked slowly up the dusty drive toward the ranch house, and Scout circled around them protectively, and the dog seemed to understand that something important was happening. The ranch house was simple and clean, and inside everything spoke of a life lived with purpose and care, and there were photographs on the mantel showing a younger Thomas with a beautiful woman who Sarah assumed was his late wife, and there were pictures of children and grandchildren scattered throughout the rooms. Thomas helped Sarah to the bedroom that had once belonged to his daughter when she was growing up, and the room still had lace curtains that Margaret had sewn by hand, and a quilt on the bed that had been passed down through 3 generations. "I need to examine you, if that's all right," Thomas said, and his voice was respectful and calm. "And I delivered plenty of calves in my time, and I helped bring 2 of my grandchildren into this world when their mothers couldn't make it to the hospital. In time." Sarah nodded, because the pain was getting stronger, and she knew she didn't have much choice, and there was something about this man that made her feel safe despite the strangeness of the situation. Thomas washed his hands thoroughly, and he spoke to her in a low, soothing voice, telling her about the ranch and about Margaret, and about how life on the prairie taught you to handle whatever came your way with grace and determination. "The baby is coming soon," he said after his examination, "and we're going to do this together, and you're going to be just fine." Sarah wanted to believe him, but fear gripped her heart because this wasn't how it was supposed to happen, and she was supposed to be in a hospital with doctors and nurses and her sister holding her hand, and instead she was in a stranger's house with a rancher who smelled of hay and leather and honest work. Thomas called his daughter Rebecca, who lived in town and who had been a nurse before she retired, and while they waited for her to arrive, he boiled water and gathered clean towels, and he stayed by Sarah's side, talking to her and keeping her calm. "Tell me about the baby's father," he said gently, and not because he was prying, but because he knew that talking would help keep her mind off the pain. Sarah's face clouded over, and she was quiet for a long moment. Before she spoke, "He left," she said simply. "And when he found out I was pregnant, he said he wasn't ready to be a father, and I haven't heard from him since." Thomas nodded, and he didn't offer platitudes or easy comfort, because he knew that some wounds ran too deep for simple words. "My Margaret used to say that sometimes the hardest things in life turn out to be the greatest blessings," Thomas said, and his voice was soft with memory. "And we lost our first baby when Margaret was 6 months along, and we thought we'd never recover from that grief. But then Rebecca came along 2 years later, and she taught us that life has its own way of working things out." Sarah listened, and despite her pain, she found comfort in his words. Rebecca arrived just as the contractions were coming fast and hard, and she was a sturdy woman in her late 30s with her father's calm demeanor and her mother's gentle hands, and she took over with quiet efficiency, while Thomas stepped back to give them space. "But," Sarah reached out and grabbed his hand, "and please don't go," she said, "and I know this is strange, but I need you here." Thomas looked at his daughter, and Rebecca nodded. And so he stayed, and he held Sarah's hand, and he told her stories about the ranch, and about Margaret, and about how the prairie taught you that strength came from enduring and that beauty came from weathering storms. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Sarah thought she couldn't go on. But Thomas and Rebecca were there, guiding her and encouraging her and reminding her that women had been doing this since the beginning of time. And then finally, as the last rays of sunlight faded from the western sky, and the stars began to appear in that vast Montana darkness, there came a cry that was ancient and new all at once. "It's a boy," Rebecca announced, and she was smiling through tears, "and he's perfect." Sarah wept as they placed the baby in her arms, and he was small and red-faced and beautiful, and she looked up at Thomas, and she saw that his eyes were wet too. "Thank you," she whispered, "and I don't know how to thank you enough." Thomas patted her hand gently. "And you just did," he said. Rebecca stayed with them that night, making sure both mother and baby were stable and comfortable, and in the morning she examined them both again and declared them healthy and strong. Sarah spent 3 days at the ranch recovering, and during that time she and Thomas talked for hours, and she learned about his life, and he learned about hers, and a bond formed between them that neither could quite explain. He had grown up on this land, and he had married his high school sweetheart, and they had raised 3 children here, and he had watched the seasons turn 50 times, and he had buried his parents and his wife in the small cemetery on the hill. And he had learned that life was about showing up and doing what needed to be done, even when it was hard. Sarah had grown up in Seattle, and she had moved to Montana for a job that fell through, and she had met a man she thought she loved, and when he left she found herself alone and pregnant in a place where she knew almost no one. On the 3rd day, Sarah said she should probably go and try to reach her sister's place, but even as she said it, she felt a reluctance she couldn't. Named Thomas was quiet for a moment, and then he spoke. "You know," he said, "and the bunkhouse hasn't been used in years, but it's sound, and I could fix it up, and if you needed a place to stay for a while until you get on your feet, well, you'd be welcome here." Sarah looked at him in surprise. "And why would you do that for me?" she asked. Thomas smiled, and it was the first real smile she had seen from him. "Because Margaret would have wanted me to," he said, "and because I've got more space than I need, and because that baby deserves to grow up somewhere where people care about him." Sarah felt tears welling up again, and she seemed to cry so easily these days. "I don't want to be a burden," she said. "You wouldn't be," Thomas replied, "and truth is I could use some help around here. And when you're ready, maybe you could help with the bookkeeping and the ranch correspondence and things that I've let slide since Margaret passed." And so Sarah stayed Thomas, cleaned out the bunkhouse, and it took him 2 weeks working in his methodical way. And Rebecca came out to help, and she brought curtains and dishes and all the things a young mother would need, and neighbors stopped by when they heard the story, and they brought casseroles and baby clothes and offers of help. The first winter was hard because Montana winters always are, but the bunkhouse was warm and snug, and Sarah learned to appreciate the quiet of the prairie